Hi, I'm Bailey Sweet. In this 3-part series, we are going to show you how poverty and hopelessness has led to decades of crime and unrest here in the South Sound. We, as a community and an industry, need to understand what's happening on our streets to better understand how to protect ourselves, our businesses, and our property. At the same time, understanding where we can help and how we can protect our youth from being sucked up by the crime on our street. About 30 miles south of Seattle, one of the richest cities in the United States, lies another beautiful but dangerous city, Tacoma, Washington, also known as the Gritty City. According to last year's crime data that came out for 2022, published by Statista, Tacoma is one of the most violent and dangerous cities in America right now. In 2022, the Gritty City also ranked number 1 for property crime. Most people that visit here have no idea that this place has the potential to take their lives if they're not careful and don't protect themselves. This devastation began here in the 1980s with the introduction of highly addictive substances that were flooding the streets of Los Angeles. This created an explosion of dealers that came to the Tacoma and Seattle area in the 1980s and the 1990s to sell the products that they were getting in LA at wholesale prices. This caused friction and created local gangs that have battled here for decades. This fighting can all be tracked to a series of events that happened in 1988. This is when a 17-year-old named Bernard Houston's life was taken on the corner of 23rd and Sheridan in the Hilltop neighborhood of Tacoma. The Hilltop neighborhood in Tacoma is historically a Black community because of redlining. Redlining is the practice of denying creditworthy applicants a loan for housing in a certain neighborhood, even though the person may otherwise be eligible for that loan. These areas were literally colored red on maps. They were handed out to real estate agents and strictly enforced by neighborhood covenants. These policies that were adopted here in the 30s were outlawed 50 years ago, but their effects remain visible. It is said by researchers that it's as if some of these places have been trapped in the past, locking neighborhoods into concentrated poverty. In the early 1980s, Tacoma civic leaders sought federal dollars by accepting a large number of Cuban refugees after the Cuban Adjustment Act and the Cuban Relocation Program. Many of these Cubans were prison inmates released by Fidel Castro. These Cubans violently took over the illicit illegal trade on Tacoma's hilltop. Around 1984, an unknown Los Angeles Crip association began organizing local hilltop youth to deal their products coming out of South America. After this, a violent struggle between Cuban dealers and the Crips ensued. Eventually, the Cubans that were involved in this trade were either found no longer living, or if they did survive, they left town. By 1985, a kid named Wayne Parker, who went by OG Freeze, started the Hilltop Bloods, saying if he was going to be in a gang, he would build his own. At 17, Parker had already established a reckless and dangerous reputation on the Hill, as well as making several enemies during an incredibly violent time when the Cubans and the Los Angeles Crips were still battling over Tacoma's streets. Parker even went as far as to having aftermarket, bulletproof windows installed on his red Chevy Blazer. Most people don't remember the Hilltop Bloods anymore. Their appearance at the time, though, would spark the match for another homegrown group to start just a few blocks away. In 1986, the largest of all of the homegrown organizations in the Pacific Northwest began. The Hilltop Crips were formed by 2 brothers, Diamond and Malone Boyd, their cousins, and some friends. They would start out with just a few dozen, but quickly they grew to over 500 or 600 members. By 1987, the original 44 Local Boys had begun on South 44th Street in the Shalashan housing projects, as well as the Pyrus that relocated from Los Angeles County. These 2 groups would ride in the same car together and would become the largest organization that dominated the East Side neighborhood, known as the East Side Pyru. For almost 2 years, the Hilltop and the East Side actually got along. They were making serious cash together. It seemed like they had found their own way out of poverty with this new rock that was taking over the streets. Until in 1988, when a known Hilltop member, Sanu Good, was hanging out in the Shalashan housing projects wearing a red coat and hat. This is when he was confronted by an Eastside Crip named Mondale McCain. Mondale must have mistaken him for a Piru member. The two instantly started fighting without even hardly saying a word to each other. This is when Sanu from the Hilltop allegedly pulled out a gun, striking Mondale with 3 rounds to his back as he was fleeing the conflict. This incident caused a lot of frustration on the east side and would result in Hilltop members no longer being welcome to the east side neighborhood. Just a couple weeks later, Bernard Houston, aka Clown, and Michael Jeter, 2 known Hilltop members, allegedly riddled an Eastside Piru member's house with bullets. In retaliation, 2 carloads of Eastside members drove to the Hilltop looking for Crips the next night. On 23rd and Sheridan, they spotted Houston and Jeter in a car. One of them was reported hearing, "What's up, blood?" and then gunfire erupted. This is when Houston from the Hilltops was hit in the head. Tacoma police would find Houston unconscious and bleeding heavily, while still clutching his revolver in his hand. The 6-shot revolver was still warm from recently being fired, with 5 live rounds still in the chamber. Staff Sergeant Bill Folk was stationed at Washington's Fort Lewis when he purchased a home in Tacoma. The house was located on Ash Street in the Hilltop section of the city, which he knew had been overrun by poverty and violence. Folk only paid $10,000 for the house, though, betting the home would be a good investment down the road. Staff Sergeant Folk was sure that the young men residing in a house across the street were operating one of hundreds of trap houses located in the city. To find out, he installed a camera on one of his windows. This is allegedly when Hilltop members became aware of the surveillance system and took measures to knock it out, including throwing rotten pears at the device. When that didn't work, they attempted to hit it with some friendly fire. Folk confronted the Hilltop members, telling them to stop letting off their guns at his house and dealing in the neighborhood. As expected, this didn't go well. They told the Army Ranger they didn't know who he was messing with. Following his interaction with the Hilltop members, Staff Sergeant Folk became convinced that they may attack him. He sent his wife away and asked his fellow Rangers to come over for a barbecue. Between 10 and 15 obliged and came armed with some serious firepower. This turned out to be a smart move, as on September 23, 1989, Folk's residence came under attack. The group was probably surprised, though, when Army Rangers took up proper defense positions and returned fire. The fight went on for about 10 minutes before police officers arrived on the scene and put an end to it. Most of the Hilltop members ran away, but 2 were detained and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. The Rangers were not charged, but their weapons were confiscated. The craziest thing about the Ash Street incidents is that no one was killed or hurt, despite over 300 rounds being fired in a residential neighborhood. This story continues to get the most amount of attention to this day. I guess it's because it involved U.S. Army Rangers. This really was nothing compared to what happened over the next 20 years in Tacoma, as several criminal organizations from Los Angeles would come to the Tacoma and Seattle area to capitalize on the street market that was worth a lot of money at the time. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next 2 parts of this series, where we will show you how a problem that was once isolated to the Hilltop has spread to low-income neighborhoods all over the Seattle area as this war raged on.